story revolves around the Moore family, which consisted of the parents Josiah and Sarah, and their 4 children: Herman Montgomery, who was 11, Murray Catherine, who was 10, Arthur Boyd, who was 7, and Paul Vernon, who was 5. Way back in 1912, on the 9th of June, the Moore family were spending their evening attending a Children's Day programme at the local church, which was organised by the mother, Sarah. The Moore children had brought 2 of their friends along to the Children's Day, the Stillinger sisters, Ina May, who was 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, who was 12. Earlier that day, Murray Catherine had invited the Stillinger sisters to spend the night at the Moore house, and they accepted. So Mr. Moore rang the parents of the Stillinger sisters to ask if they could spend the night, but the parents were out. So it was Ina and Lena's older sister Blanche who answered the phone, and she gave the okay for her sisters to stay, and she would pass a message on to her parents. This was probably a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her days. The event started at 8 p.m. and ended at 9:30 p.m. The Moore family, along with the Stillinger sisters, arrived home at some time between 9:45 p.m. and 10 p.m. and settled down for the night. The next morning at around 5 a.m, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbour, was out in the garden hanging laundry. And by 7 a.m, she noticed that the Moores had not yet woken up to start their chores, and she thought that the house seemed particularly quiet, as by this time the family were normally awake and going about their business. When 8 a.m. arrived and there was still no sign of the Moores, Mary Peckham decided to investigate. She went over to the Moores' house and knocked on the door, but there was no response. So she tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. At a loss what to do next, she decided to let out the Moore's chickens before ringing Josiah Moore's brother, Ross Moore, to come and check on the family. When the brother arrived, he first of all tried to peer through the windows, and when that failed, he produced a key to the front door which led him into the parlour. The house was in total darkness, and apparently it smelled of death. As he stepped inside, he went directly to the doorway of the first room, which was just off the parlour, whilst Mrs. Peckham stayed on the porch. The brother then extended his arm and pushed open the door and let it swing open, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the room, lying upon a blood-stained bed, were the dead bodies of the Stillinger sisters. Immediately, Ross Moore rushed back out of the house onto the porch and told Mrs. Peckham to call the local sheriff. Once Marshal Hank Horton arrived, he searched the house and discovered not only the bodies of the Stillinger sisters, but the bodies of the Moore family. Every single person inside the house had been brutally murdered by some axe-wielding maniac as they slept. Their faces had all been totally caved in and were unrecognisable. It's believed that the night before, as the Moore family returned home at around 10 p.m, they had showed the Stillinger sisters to their room for the night, which was situated downstairs off the parlour, the room that Ross Moore entered and discovered the bodies. After the Stillinger sisters were settled for the night, then the rest of the Moore family retired to their rooms and fell asleep. At some point in the night, an unknown person entered the house, or maybe he was already inside the house hiding. This is thought to be the case because of 2 smoked cigarettes that were found in the attic. Another strange detail was that there was no signs of forced entry, which also suggests that the killer was already in the house. Either that, or he simply let himself in through an unlocked door. And back in those days, an unlocked door was not uncommon. People were a lot more trustworthy. But I tend to side with the theory that the killer was already in the house. I think this is backed up as well by the killer actually locking up after himself when he left the house. The intruder then obtained Josiah Moore's own axe and an oil lamp which had the chimney removed, and the wick was altered to make the flames smaller. The killer then proceeded directly to the parents' bedroom, possibly passing the Stillinger sisters' bedroom on his way up the stairs. As the intruder crept very quietly into the Moore's bedroom, he went over to the bedside and held the axe high above his head and brought it down multiple times upon Josiah's skull. Over and over, Josiah received more blows to the face than anyone in the house, totally destroying all recognisable features of his face, reducing everything to pulpy flesh and bone matter. The extent of the damage to his face was so severe that not even his eyes remained. And then the killer did the same to Sarah, at times catching and gouging holes in the bedroom ceiling with the axe, which may have suggested he was in a frenzy. Now with the parents out of the way, he ventured into each of the children's rooms. Herman, Murray, Catherine, Arthur and Paul were next. They were bludgeoned in the head, the same way as the parents. When he had finished with the more children, he then went on to the downstairs bedroom where Ina and Lena lay in their beds. It's believed that as he bludgeoned Ina, Lena woke up and tried in vain to fight back. This was believed to be the case because every person in the house were killed as they slept and were still in their covers. But it seemed that Lena had been killed out of her sheets as if she had tried to flee and fight back, but ultimately she failed. It was reported that she was found in a very strange position with her nightdress hitched up over her waist. Although there was no evidence of rape, she may have been inappropriately touched due to the way that she was positioned and the discovery of a blood smear on the inside of her leg, and this was believed to have been made by the killer as he pulled her down the bed. Many believe after the killer had gone around killing all the occupants of the house, he then went round a second time to inflict more damage upon the already dead family. And this was believed because one of Sarah's boots were found knocked over under the bed and it was full of blood, which suggested that the blood had time to drip off the bed into the shoe before it was knocked over, which suggests that the killer had revisited each of the dead bodies and carried on hacking at their faces until all that was left was mashed up skull fragments and brain matter, which was all over the headboard and pillows. And upon his second visit, he kicked over the blood-filled shoe. All the victims, apart from Josiah, had been attacked with the blunt end of the axe. And for whatever reason, Josiah got the blade end of the axe. There were some other strange details found inside the house as well as the dead bodies. The killer had gone around the house and covered up what was left of the victims' faces with bed sheets. Also, every curtain was drawn apart from one or two windows that did not have curtains. It was on these windows that the killer simply covered them up with clothing. He also went around the house covering up all the mirrors before making himself at home and making himself a snack. There was also a pan of bloodied water that was left on the kitchen table next to the plate of uneaten food he had prepared for himself. It is believed that he used the water to clean his hands. It was also reported that Lena was found in a strange position, like I mentioned before, with a nightdress hitched up over her waist and she wasn't wearing any underwear, and a coat covered her face. She lay with one leg kicked out of the bed and with one arm shoved up under her pillow with a defensive wound to the other arm, which suggested that she tried to fight back. Although there was no evidence of rape, she may have been molested due to the way she was positioned and the discovery of the blood smear on the inside of her knee, which was believed to have been made by the killer. And the only reason I bring this up again is because there was one more disgusting detail in that bedroom. The police found a slab of 2 pounds of bacon wrapped up in a cloth or towel on the floor, which had been taken from the Moore's icebox. It's believed that the killer may have used the slab of bacon to masturbate with. Along with the bacon, the axe was also found in the Stillinger sisters' room, and an attempt had been made to wipe it clean. The killer then left the chimney-less lamp at the top of the stairway and left the house, locking up behind him. Now, after word of mouth spread about the killings, people started to make their way to the house to see what was going on, and the police quickly lost control of the crime scene, as literally nearly 100 curious onlookers traipsed through the house, seriously contaminating the crime scene. It was only a local druggist who had the great idea to take pictures to try and capture some evidence and clues, but he was promptly thrown out of the house. But when it comes down to it, back in those days DNA testing was not even a thing and fingerprinting was in its early days, so it is hard to say that if under different circumstances the murders could have been solved. To me, this bears many resemblances to the Lizzie Borden case, where many people did actually traipse through the house before they even attempted to make it a crime scene and try and preserve some of the evidence. It just seems to me that back in those days the police were just totally unequipped and unexperienced to deal with cases such as this. And the public, who had some kind of morbid, sick curiosity with the murders, were allowed to just traipse through the house. It was even said that one member of the public took a fragment of Josiah's skull as some kind of morbid keepsake. Another thing I find shocking about this case is that many people knew that the Stillinger sisters were dead before the actual mother found out. Apparently, she rang the operator and asked to be connected to the house, and the operator responded, "Everyone in that house is dead." I can only imagine the horrors that poor woman felt when the operator told her that. So, although the killer was never brought to justice, there were a few suspects. First we have the Reverend George Kelly, who had quite a disturbing past. The Reverend was actually at the Children's Day event helping to run it with the Moore family. He'd arrived in town the day before and left town on the 10th of June between 5 and 5:50 am, only a few hours after the massacre was discovered. Apparently, in his past, he had suffered a mental breakdown and had been caught peeping on different occasions, as well as asking young girls and women to pose nude for him. Apparently, in the weeks that followed, he became obsessed with the murders and started writing letters, quite a few letters, asking for details of the murders and even claiming that he may have witnessed the murders himself, although it was known that his mental health was questionable at best, and all suspicion that he may have been responsible for the murders was simply pushed to one side. That being said, years later in 1914 he was arrested for sexually harassing a woman who had applied for a job to be a secretary, and he had been arrested for sending her obscene letters through the mail. Fast forward a little to 1917 and he was arrested and interrogated by the police and actually confessed to the axe murder, saying that God made him do it, but later recanted his confession. Apparently the confession was a forced confession by the police, who were apparently using intimidation and threats to get the confession. A bruise upon his cheek may have backed up this theory, and ultimately the jury did not buy that this man could have committed the murders, and he was freed. And then we have Frank Jones, an Iowa State Senator. Josiah worked for Frank at his implement shop, but one day Josiah decided to go it alone and started his own company, as well as taking a John Deere contract with him. This apparently caused a feud between the two. On top of all this, it is rumoured that Josiah was having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. It was thought that Frank had hired a man called William Mansfield to commit the murders. 2 other axe murders had been committed almost a year before in Colorado, and 2 other axe murders that occurred in Kansas just before the murder of the Moore family. It was these 2 cases that Kansas police suspected Mansfield of committing, suggesting he was a drug-fueled serial killer. Each of these crime scenes all had similar details, especially the Colorado crime scene. The windows and the dead were all covered up by sheets or clothing. There was a bowl of water left that had been used by the killer to clean himself up, and a chimney-less oil lamp was left at the foot of the bed, just like the Moore murders. As well, there were even more axe murders that had been said to have occurred along the South Pacific Railroad from 1911 to 1912. And it was in 1912 that the Villisca Axe Murders happened, which would fit it quite nicely into this time frame. Another interesting detail is that even though the introduction of looking for fingerprints was new at the time, Mansfield actually had his fingerprints on file for other crimes that he committed, and Mansfield knew about this. But no fingerprints were found at the crime scene, suggesting that the killer wore gloves, because the killer knew that his fingerprints were on file. But if there was one thing in particular that would place him as suspect number 1, it was because of the murder of his own family in 1914, 2 years after the Moore murders, which included his own wife, infant child, and mother and father-in-law, and they were all killed with an axe. In 1916, Mansfield was arrested and a trial was underway, but it was all for nothing, as Mansfield had alibis for the murders and there was just not enough evidence, and he was released. And it is believed that Frank Jones, the Iowa senator, may have helped with this. Another suspect, Henry Lee Moore, was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother months after the Moore family murders, and he carried out the murders with an axe. He was also a suspect of other axe murders and the Villisca Axe Murders, and he did serve 36 years in prison, but only for the murder of his mother and grandmother. As well as all these suspects, there was also talk of a serial killer who liked to travel the railroads and murder people as they slept in very similar manner as a Moore family, slain with a blunt side of the axe, with bedsheets covering the face of the victims, as well as all the other traits, the bowl of water, the lamp, and covering the windows. And it is because of this that many hobos became suspects, including a man named Andrew Sawyer. According to Thomas Dyer, a bridge foreman and pile driver for the railroad, Andrew Sawyer had turned up on the morning of the murders asking for work, looking quite dishevelled. He wore a brown suit with mud-covered shoes and wet trousers up to the knees. His presentation was somewhat lacking, but Dyer needed an extra man and decided to take him on. Apparently, Andrew Sawyer was somewhat strange and seemed very interested in the axe murders which had reached the newspapers the day after, and become very paranoid that he had become a suspect, as he was new to the area. Dyer's men also show concern that Andrew Sawyer liked to sleep fully clothed, clutching his axe. Slightly worried about his interest in the axe murders, the foreman informed the police, who arrested Andrew Sawyer, but eventually let him go when he provided an alibi. This case will now probably never be solved. We can only speculate who the killer or killers were, just like the Lizzie Borden case. People will have their own theories. But unfortunately, the murder of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters will remain another unsolved mystery.